The desert blooms at midnight. In the very heart of spiritual desolation, where April proves cruelest and mixing memory with desire becomes unbearable torment, something extraordinary occurs. The possibility of divine encounter emerges from the fragments themselves. This is not the comfortable God of Sunday services or the easy consolations of popular religion, but the terrible and wonderful presence that speaks through silence, moves through stillness, and illuminates through darkness. My journey from the hollow men to the intersection of time and eternity was not a retreat from modernity's challenges, but a penetration deeper into them until their very sterility became fertile ground for grace. The wasteland is not the opposite of the promised land, it is often the necessary prelude to it. Tonight, we shall trace the precise cartography of spiritual awakening within cultural collapse, discovering how authentic religious experience grows not despite our fragmented age, but through intimate engagement with its deepest wounds. For it is precisely in our most honest confrontation with meaninglessness that meaning reveals itself most powerfully. The God who emerges from these explorations is no easier comfort, but the living flame that burns away everything false until only the essential remains. Chapter 1: The Landscape of Spiritual Desolation. When I first walked the streets of London, observing the crowds flowing over London Bridge, I witnessed something more profound than urban alienation. I saw the perfect conditions for authentic spiritual awakening. The modern city, with its anonymous multitudes and mechanical rhythms, had stripped away the comfortable illusions that previously masked humanity's fundamental spiritual poverty. This was not decline but revelation. The wasteland I encountered was simultaneously external and internal. The literal wastelands left by the Great War mirrored the interior desolation of souls who had lost contact with any transcendent dimension of existence. Yet this apparent catastrophe contained hidden grace. Only when we have exhausted all superficial sources of meaning do we become receptive to deeper truth. Consider the spiritual significance of fragmentation itself. The broken images, the heap of broken mirrors, the fragments shored against our ruins, these are not merely symptoms of cultural decay but necessary preparations for genuine encounter with the divine. God does not typically visit comfortable, self-satisfied civilizations. The divine enters through cracks in our certainty, through moments when our carefully constructed meanings collapse into authentic question. The hollow men I described were not fundamentally different from the spiritually alive, they simply had not yet recognized their emptiness as the precondition for fullness. Their very inability to access easy consolations forced them toward more fundamental spiritual ground. The whimper with which the world ends is also the first sound of something new beginning. This recognition transformed my understanding of modernity's spiritual crisis. What appeared as unprecedented alienation from the sacred was actually an opportunity for more authentic religious experience than had been possible for centuries. The comfortable Christianity of previous eras often prevented genuine spiritual encounter through its very comfort. Only when stripped of inherited certainties could we discover what remained when everything non-essential had been burned away. The wasteland, properly understood, is not the opposite of holy ground but rather holy ground perceived without romantic illusions. The Desert Fathers knew this truth. Spiritual awakening typically requires a period of apparent abandonment by everything that previously provided meaning. The modern condition had involuntarily recreated these optimal conditions for authentic religious experience on a civilizational scale. Chapter 2: The False Gods of Progress and Their Collapse. The 20th century offered numerous substitute deities to fill the void left by traditional religious faith's apparent retreat. Progress, science, nationalism, individual self-expression, each promised salvation through purely human means. I watched these new religions rise and reveal their limitations, creating the very spiritual crisis that would eventually open pathways to more authentic transcendence. The cult of progress proved particularly seductive yet ultimately hollow. It promised that human history moved inevitably toward greater enlightenment, justice, and happiness through technological and social advancement. The Great War shattered this naive optimism more thoroughly than any theological argument could have managed. When the most advanced civilization in human history used its sophistication to create unprecedented destruction, the fundamental insufficiency of purely secular salvation became undeniable. Science, too, revealed its limitations as ultimate source of meaning. While invaluable for understanding natural processes, scientific method could not address the deepest human questions about purpose, value, and ultimate significance. A worldview that reduced reality to measurable phenomena left the human spirit starving in the midst of unprecedented material abundance. The very success of scientific technology highlighted what it could not provide. Individual self-expression and personal authenticity became new forms of spiritual seeking, but these too proved inadequate when pursued as ends in themselves. The romantic notion that truth could be found by turning inward to discover one's true self ignored the fundamental insight that the unexamined self is often the primary obstacle to authentic spiritual experience. Self-worship is still idolatry, however sophisticated its psychological formulations. These false salvations shared a common limitation: they sought to address ultimate questions through finite means. Each attempted to make relative things into absolutes, creating what theologians recognize as idolatry. Their inevitable failure was not accidental but structural. Finite realities cannot bear the weight of infinite human longing. Yet their collapse was providential rather than merely tragic. Each broken idol cleared space for more authentic spiritual possibility. The disillusionment with secular salvation systems created what I came to recognize as a blessed emptiness, a space where genuine transcendence might once again be encountered. This process of systematic disillusionment was necessary preparation for authentic religious experience. Only when we have thoroughly exhausted the alternatives to divine reality do we become truly receptive to grace. The spiritual crisis of modernity was thus simultaneously the necessary prelude to spiritual renewal. The key insight was recognizing that these false gods had to be allowed to reveal their insufficiency naturally rather than being rejected prematurely through mere intellectual argument. Their experiential failure provided more convincing testimony to the need for genuine transcendence than any theological demonstration could have accomplished. Chapter 3: The Dark Night of Cultural Soul. What John of the Cross described as the dark night of the soul, I witnessed occurring on a civilizational scale. Entire cultures found themselves stripped of the spiritual consolations that had previously sustained them, left apparently abandoned by any transcendent source of meaning. This was not punishment but pedagogy, a necessary stage in collective spiritual maturation. The dark night serves a specific function in authentic spiritual development. It removes the supports we mistake for God in order to prepare us for encounter with God directly. Personal ego, social identity, inherited religious forms, all these intermediary attachments must be temporarily dissolved so that we might discover what remains when everything non-essential has been burned away. Modern culture experienced this process involuntarily. The traditional sources of meaning, inherited religious authority, stable social hierarchies, confidence in rational progress, had been systematically undermined by historical forces beyond any individual's control. This created widespread anxiety and disorientation, but also unprecedented opportunity for authentic spiritual discovery. The symptoms of cultural dark night surrounded us everywhere. The sense that life had lost coherent meaning, that individual actions occurred in a moral vacuum, that history itself had become meaningless succession rather than meaningful development, these were precisely the conditions that spiritual masters throughout history had recognized as optimal for genuine awakening. In my own experience, the transition from spiritual complacency to authentic seeking required passage through genuine darkness. The comfortable assumptions about meaning and purpose that I had inherited had to be thoroughly questioned before deeper truth could emerge. This process was often painful, but ultimately liberating. The cultural dimension of this experience meant that entire populations were being forced through similar spiritual territory simultaneously. The breakdown of inherited certainties that had once occurred only to exceptional individuals was now happening collectively. This created both unprecedented danger and unprecedented opportunity. The danger lay in the possibility that civilizations might respond to this darkness through false solutions, totalitarian ideologies, militant nationalisms, or escapist fantasies that promised easy return to previous certainties. These responses would abort the spiritual process and create worse forms of darkness. The opportunity lay in recognizing the dark night for what it truly was, not random suffering but purposeful spiritual surgery, removing the obstacles to authentic religious experience that had accumulated over centuries of spiritual complacency. If properly understood and navigated, cultural dark night could lead to collective spiritual renaissance. The key was learning to endure the darkness without premature flight toward false consolations. This required what I came to call spiritual patience, the willingness to remain in uncertainty long enough for genuine clarity to emerge naturally rather than manufacturing artificial certainties through force of will. Chapter 4: Fragments as Sacred Text. In the midst of apparent meaninglessness, I discovered that the broken pieces of cultural and personal experience could become a new form of scripture if read with sufficient attention. The fragments themselves, disconnected memories, overheard conversations, literary quotations torn from context, began to reveal patterns of meaning invisible to more systematic approaches. This was not merely aesthetic technique but spiritual methodology. Traditional religious texts had always worked through juxtaposition and illusion, allowing meaning to emerge through the intersection of different voices and perspectives. The fragmentary nature of modern experience recreated these optimal conditions for revelatory insight. Consider how the mind actually encounters truth in daily life. We do not receive systematic theological instruction from heaven, but rather collect meaningful moments that gradually coalesce into deeper understanding. A line of poetry heard at precisely the right moment, a gesture observed in the street, a memory suddenly illuminated by present circumstance. These fragments often convey more authentic spiritual instruction than formal religious discourse. The technique of collage that I employed in The Wasteland reflected this recognition that truth in our time comes through assembly rather than systematic exposition. The poem does not argue for meaning but demonstrates how meaning can be discovered through patient attention to what appears chaotic. Each fragment contains a particle of light that contributes to an emerging pattern of significance. This approach required developing new forms of spiritual attention. Instead of seeking truth through logical analysis or inherited authority, one learned to notice the sacred dimension hidden within ordinary experience. The divine speaks constantly, but usually through indirection and suggestion rather than direct announcement. The fragments also revealed how personal and cultural memory could become sources of ongoing revelation. The past was not dead but remained actively present, offering instruction to those willing to listen carefully. Literary tradition, historical events, childhood memories, all these retain their capacity to illuminate present experience when approached with proper receptivity. This fragmentary revelation particularly suited the modern condition because it honored the actual texture of contemporary experience while revealing its hidden spiritual dimensions. Rather than rejecting modernity's disconnected character, this approach discovered transcendence within it. The practice required what I came to call negative capability, the ability to remain present to uncertainty without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Truth emerged not through aggressive pursuit but through patient attention to what was actually given in experience. Each fragment functioned like a piece of colored glass in a cathedral window. Individually, they might appear broken and meaningless, but when properly arranged in relation to the light of spiritual attention, they created patterns of extraordinary beauty and significance. This discovery transformed my understanding of how divine revelation operates in ordinary life. God does not typically communicate through dramatic supernatural intervention but through the sanctification of normal human experience when approached with sufficient spiritual sensitivity. Chapter 5: The Conversion of Time. The most profound spiritual discovery involved recognizing that time itself could be transfigured through proper attention. What appeared as mere chronological succession, past, present, future following each other mechanically, could suddenly reveal itself as the intersection of temporal and eternal dimensions. This recognition emerged gradually through years of careful observation. Certain moments seemed to contain more reality than others, to participate in a different quality of time altogether. These were not simply psychologically significant moments but genuine openings where ordinary duration gave way to something qualitatively different. In For Quartets, I attempted to map this transformed temporality with precision. The moment in the rose garden, where past and future converged in an eternal present, exemplified how time could become transparent to timeless meaning. These experiences were not rare mystical states available only to specialists, but natural possibilities present within ordinary human experience when approached with sufficient attention. The key insight involved recognizing that the temporal and eternal are not separate realms but different dimensions of the same reality. Every moment contains eternity, but we typically experience only its chronological surface. Spiritual awakening involves learning to perceive the eternal dimension that is always already present within temporal experience. This transformation of temporal experience proved especially crucial for addressing modern anxiety about meaninglessness. When life is experienced as mere succession of moments without connection to any larger pattern, existence becomes unbearable. But when ordinary time reveals its participation in eternal significance, even difficult experiences acquire profound meaning. The practice required developing new forms of temporal attention. Instead of constantly fleeing the present moment through memory or anticipation, one learned to inhabit the now with sufficient depth to discover its eternal dimensions. This was not escapism but deeper realism, recognizing more of what was actually present in experience. Prayer and poetry served as particularly effective methods for this temporal transformation. Both required forms of attention that moved beyond ordinary chronological consciousness toward more fundamental dimensions of experience. In genuine prayer or authentic poetic composition, time ceased to feel like burden and became vehicle for encounter with ultimate reality. The cultural implications were enormous. A civilization that experienced time only chronologically would inevitably become nihilistic, since chronological time leads only to death and decay. But a culture capable of recognizing the eternal within the temporal could discover inexhaustible sources of meaning and renewal. This discovery also provided practical guidance for navigating personal difficulties. When viewed only chronologically, suffering appears merely negative, loss, limitation, decay. But when experienced within the intersection of time and eternity, suffering could become a form of participation in ultimate reality, sharing in the divine life through willing acceptance of finitude. The transformation was not automatic but required consistent spiritual practice. Like learning to read or play an instrument, developing sensitivity to the eternal dimension of temporal experience took time and effort. But the rewards justified the investment. Chapter 6: The Community of Saints and Sinners. Authentic spiritual awakening revealed that individual salvation was inseparable from participation in a community that transcended ordinary social boundaries. This was not merely the local congregation or even the institutional church, but what I came to recognize as the communion of all souls seeking authentic relationship with ultimate reality across time and space. The modern emphasis on individual religious experience, while containing important truth, had become dangerously isolated from this larger community of spiritual seeking. Personal spirituality cut off from tradition and community typically devolves into sophisticated forms of narcissism. Genuine spiritual life requires both individual depth and communal connection. This community included not only the living but also the dead and the not yet born. The great spiritual explorers of the past remained present as living influences, offering guidance and inspiration to contemporary seekers. Literary tradition, properly understood, was one form of this ongoing spiritual communion. Reading Dante or the metaphysical poets was not merely academic exercise but actual conversation with souls who had walked similar paths. The distinction between saints and sinners proved less significant than might be expected. What mattered was not moral perfection but honest engagement with the spiritual dimension of existence. The community included all who had recognized their need for something beyond purely human satisfaction, regardless of their success in achieving conventional virtue. This recognition transformed my understanding of human relationships generally. Every encounter with another person became potential spiritual instruction. The annoying colleague, the difficult family member, the stranger on the street, each offered opportunities for practicing the attention and compassion that spiritual life requires. The community also extended beyond explicitly religious individuals to include all who serve truth in their particular domains. Scientists committed to honest investigation, artists pursuing authentic expression, thinkers seeking genuine understanding, these too participated in the larger community of souls oriented toward ultimate reality. Participation in this community provided both support and accountability for individual spiritual development. The isolation that characterizes much modern experience dissolved when one recognized connection to this larger fellowship of seekers. Personal struggles became shared endeavors, individual insights contributed to collective understanding. The practice required learning to recognize the sacred dimension present within ordinary human relationships. This was not sentimental idealization but realistic acknowledgement that every person carries divine light, however obscured by sin or ignorance. Developing eyes to see this hidden glory was essential spiritual work. Prayer became not merely private communication with God but participation in the ongoing conversation of this eternal community. When I prayed, I joined my voice to countless others across history who had offered similar prayers, creating a collective spiritual energy greater than any individual contribution. This communal dimension also provided practical guidance for navigating the complexities of modern life. The wisdom accumulated by generations of spiritual seekers offered tested strategies for addressing perennial human challenges. Personal experience illuminated by communal wisdom proved more reliable than either individual insight or inherited tradition alone. The community transcended all conventional boundaries, nationality, race, class, denomination, historical period. What united its members was shared recognition of the spiritual dimension of existence and commitment to authentic seeking rather than comfortable illusion. Chapter 7: The Dance at the Still Point. The culmination of spiritual journey led to recognition of what I called the still point of the turning world, that eternal center where all movement finds its source and meaning. This was not static immobility but rather the source of all authentic action, the point where human activity becomes aligned with divine purpose. At this still point, the apparent oppositions that torture ordinary consciousness resolve into higher unity. Past and future meet in an eternal present, human limitation participates in divine infinity, individual identity discovers itself through self-surrender. These are not mere intellectual paradoxes but living realities accessible through sufficient spiritual development. The dance at the still point represents human action that has been transformed through alignment with transcendent purpose. Instead of frantic activity driven by ego and anxiety, movement becomes expression of divine energy working through surrendered human instruments. Work becomes worship, ordinary activities become forms of prayer. This transformation did not require withdrawal from ordinary responsibilities but rather their transfiguration through proper understanding. The businessman attending to commerce, the parent caring for children, the artist creating beauty, All these activities could become vehicles for divine expression when performed with appropriate spiritual consciousness. The key was learning to act from stillness rather than agitation. When the deepest center of personality had been aligned with divine will, external activities naturally expressed this internal harmony. There was no conflict between contemplation and action because true contemplation naturally flowed into appropriate action. This understanding revolutionized my approach to poetry and criticism. Writing became not personal self-expression but service to truth-seeking expression through human instruments. The poet's job was to become sufficiently transparent that authentic reality could speak through individual talent guided by tradition. The still point also provided solution to the modern problem of meaninglessness. When individual action participated in eternal purpose, even apparently insignificant activities acquired profound significance. There was no purely secular realm because every genuine human activity touched the sacred when performed with proper attention. Prayer and poetry converged at this point because both required the same fundamental spiritual posture, receptive attention to truth-seeking expression through surrendered human consciousness. The mystical and artistic impulses revealed themselves as different aspects of the same essential movement toward transcendence. The dance metaphor captured the essential character of mature spiritual life. Unlike the rigid control that characterizes so much religious effort, authentic spirituality involved responsive movement in harmony with divine initiative. One learned to follow the lead of grace rather than attempting to direct the spiritual process through personal will. This yielded practical guidance for navigating uncertainty and difficulty. Instead of anxious striving to control outcomes, one could learn to move responsively with whatever circumstances arose, trusting that divine purpose was working through all experiences when met with proper spiritual attention. The still point was always accessible because it represented not a special state to be achieved but the deepest truth of what we already are when illusions of separation have been dissolved. Spiritual practice was thus not self-improvement but recovery of original nature. From this perspective, the entire journey through Wasteland and Dark Night revealed itself as necessary preparation for recognizing what had been present all along but obscured by false identification with temporary forms. Conclusion. The God discovered in the modern wasteland proves to be not the comfortable deity of conventional religion but the living flame that burns away everything false until only the essential remains. This divine reality does not escape from modern conditions but encounters us precisely through them when we develop sufficient spiritual sensitivity to recognize transcendence within apparent meaninglessness. The journey from fragmentation to unity, from spiritual desolation to authentic religious experience, from chronological time to eternal significance, this path remains open to every soul willing to penetrate beneath the surface of contemporary experience. The wasteland becomes holy ground when traversed with proper attention and surrender. Your generation faces the same fundamental choice that confronted mine, whether to flee from modern complexity toward false simplicity, or to move through it toward genuine spiritual maturity. The authentic path requires more courage but yields incomparably greater rewards. The still point of the turning world awaits your discovery not in some distant heaven but at the very center of your present experience. Listen carefully to the silence between words, attend to the light hidden within apparent darkness, and you will find that the divine has been seeking you through every fragment of your broken and beautiful life.